Intonation, the thing that everybody knows when it's wrong, but no one seems to know exactly when it's right. I'm Justin Leopard with Higher Hertz, and in today's cello lesson video, we're going to take a deep dive into intonation concepts on cello. So I feel like I need to start this video by explaining some of the complexities behind intonation, some of the history of intonation, because there is that, believe it or not. I'm only going to briefly touch upon the science and everything because I know that it can get a little tedious at times, but I'm going to then relate everything back to cello, and we're going to talk about practical exercises to be able to play better in tune. So what is intonation in the first place? Well, I want to give you a very exact definition where intonation is when waveforms line up with each other. Okay, so intonation with this definition has to do with perfectly tuned intervals. So basically, every single note has a frequency, and that frequency can be expressed by one of those wave drawings. And the more revolutions of the total cycle there are per second, that's the pitch. So as a result, there's ratios between those frequencies. And if something is an octave higher, that's double the frequency. Or rather, double the frequency is what we refer to as an octave higher. That's how these things started. So in the history of intonation, these intervals were identified by the ancient Greeks. So as early as the ancient Greeks, we knew that these intervals existed in ratios. And it was thought that the purer the interval, the better the music, the more heavenly. Because it was also thought that there was a certain resonance and pattern to the celestial bodies that we now have a lot more complicated understanding of with astronomy than they did back then. But they related the movement of the heavenly bodies in the sky to music itself. And so they were very interested in the mathematics of it. So the intervals that they would have been most interested in would have been the perfect octave, the perfect fifth, the perfect fourth, and they would have considered even thirds and sixths to be a little bit dicey, a little bit dissonant. And there's a very good reason for that. The reason is that it doesn't ever work out. I mean, even the fifths and fourths thing doesn't even technically work out. So here's the problem. Here's where intonation gets dicey. If you want to go by the definition of intonation, that it's when the waveforms line up with each other, you know, that if you have a certain ratio between two notes, for example, a fifth is a 3-to-2 ratio. For every 3 vibrations of the top note, there's going to be two cycles in the waveform of the bottom note. A perfectly in tune fifth is exactly 3-to-2. Okay? And we can hear it in the harmonics on the instrument. So the octave harmonic is here, as I've talked about before, and it divides the string in half by taking advantage of the natural overtone properties. Now, I know that this can sound like a lot of big words, so all you really need to know is that the reason that we hear different notes from different instruments as different instruments has a lot to do with these other sort of frequencies that are ringing out in addition to the main, what's called the fundamental frequency of the note we play. So when we play C, C is the fundamental, but there's all these other notes that are actually also ringing. And the reason that we know that in part, practically on the instrument, is that we can play harmonics at all. So let's keep going up. We have an octave. The next harmonic that we have is a fifth, but it's actually an octave plus a fifth. And then we have 2 octaves. And then we finally have a major third. Then we have another fifth. We have a seventh, also played here. And we have 3 octaves. And then we have a seventh, also played here. And we have 3 octaves. And as you heard, there's some other ones up there too. So they keep going. And the further up you go, the more notes you get in the scale. Ultimately, you can play all of the notes in the scale. Now, you might have already noticed the problem with this. Some of the harmonics sound out of tune. But I just told you that harmonics, by taking advantage of the natural overtone series, are, like by their definition, in tune. Because they are that like perfect ratio. So what the heck happens with the 7th harmonic? I mean, it's so flat. I mean, normally you would want an F here. So let's get it in the same octave. So that's the same F in the same octave. Let's hear here. Oh, it's so flat. Now, a lot of people will think this harmonic is out of tune, but the harmonic is not out of tune. It's in tune. In tune doesn't always sound good. And so here's the problem. Here's the reason that there is a history of intonation. Because the ancient Greeks, they realized that the perfect intervals are perfect. And technically they're not, but the fourth and fifth, they only vary by 2 cents if you're going perfect, compared to what we now have as equal temperament. The octave, totally perfect. And all of the other intervals, they start to get pretty messy. So this became, this for a while actually wasn't that big of a problem, because you either had simple songs, you had things that were Gregorian chant, which is pretty much entirely these open intervals. And then you also had people playing on instruments that could kind of control their pitch, so they were able to adapt. But the problem really started with keyboards. And so you might have heard of Bach's series of compositions called the Well-Tempered Clavier. He writes all of these compositions in every single key, a prelude and a fugue. And he was trying to demonstrate a particular type of tuning system working well for all 12 keys that was called well temperament, where basically you kind of fudge the intonation a little bit so that you don't get the really grating, like basically a third of a tone flat, things that happen, even grosser dissonances and out of tuneness, just because things were in tune one way. So I know I'm getting a little complicated again, but just remember, if you tune a keyboard so that all of the notes are in tune to C, those notes will be really out of tune for some other keys. So you can't play in every key. So you either have to tune your keyboard to only play in like a handful of keys, or you have to find a system that's actually going to work for all 12 keys. Now, after a lot of debate, there's things mean tone temperament, well temperament, like Bach's. Eventually, by the mid-19th century, modern pianos were using equal temperament, which is basically an attempt to equally divide the octave into 12 notes. Every single note is exactly the same amount, but proportionally different per octave from the next note over. Basically, while we tend to think of this as making every note equally in tune, what it's really doing is making things selectively out of tune so that we don't hear any one interval or any one key as being particularly better or worse than another. And without this innovation, obviously we wouldn't have such perfect sounding pop records. We also wouldn't really have jazz theory, because all of those very complicated chords sound like utter, garbage when being played on a non-equally tempered instrument. Okay, so that's kind of the history of tuning, why it's complicated, and where it leaves us is the next place to go. So bringing all of this to cello, we as cellists have a responsibility, as we're being in tune, to making sure that we are in tune to the right context. If we're playing with a piano, we probably want to play mostly equal temperament, but we ourselves are going to run into problems all throughout the place. So there's different ways to handle the various problems that come up, and I'd like to discuss them now. So the first problem that's going to come up is going to be the piano's playing a chord. Let's say the piano's playing a G major chord, and you have a B. So is it your job, so the B is a third of the chord, is it your job to play the B in tune to G? Or is it your job to play the B the same tuning that the piano is playing B? So to know which one you should do, we can refer to a concept known as melodic versus harmonic intonation. Very, very useful concept on our instruments. Basically, when we're playing a melody, a passage, a run, we want to consider the melodic intonation. So we want to be feeling the intonation between each of the notes that we're playing. In other words, even out of context, even not equally tempered, those two notes are in tune to each other, even if they're not in tune to anything else. And so that would be an example of melodic intonation. Melodic intonation goes horizontally over time. This is the passing of time, and melodic intonation has to be connected all the way through. The second type is called harmonic intonation. Harmonic intonation is like the intonation at any given moment, okay? So back to the thing with the piano. It depends. So if we're playing a melody and we're playing past that B, we may defer to playing in more equal temperament so that we're hearing the interval between the notes. If we're sitting on the B, it might be nice to at least start it in tune and then to move it to be in tune with the B that the piano might be playing. To put another way, we can think flexibly about our intonation as cellists. And one of the great secrets and tricks that I learned after moving to LA is that you can change. You can change where your finger is. If you want to play that A, you don't have to hit it exactly on for it to still be in tune. What really matters is that you're listening to the context of what you're playing. I'll hit it flat. I'll hit it sharp. In both of those examples, there's a way to handle where you're hitting it. So you want to be able to be close. But when we talk about intonation on the instrument, one of the biggest problems that we have is that we think that the intonation is on a particular place. And I think it's easy because of pianos and because guitars give the illusion that they have that. Guitars are still different. Where you hit it in the fret is going to make a difference to how much the string bends and hence how in tune or out of tune it is. This is why I hear guitar players all the time sound out of tune, even though they tuned their guitar. It's a feel thing. And if you're not really sensitive to the true intonation of what you're playing and you're just relying on the frets, well, then you have the same problem that pianos do, having problems being actually perfectly in tune. So where this leaves us as cellists is needing to have a really acute ear and understanding for this. And I think this is why it's really important to practice double stops, which we covered in another video, because they're a great way to practice this intonation. As we discussed in that video, going back to the G major problem, if you play G here, you have this here and you want to make the B in tune to it. And then you want to make the B in tune to the open D string. Well, suddenly there's kind of a crapshoot because you don't know where the D actually is and you can't alter it. So it's a little out of tune. And then you have to make a decision. Can I adjust my finger and be a little bit more in tune with the D, knowing that I'm actually flat compared to the actual G? Another option could be to try to blend the two together, the more equal temperament approach, where that's a little out of tune, that's a little out of tune, but they're like the same amount out of tune. So it kind of works. But I think a better approach would be to change as you do that. If you wanted to do that triad, do that in tune, and then bring your finger back. That's going to be the most in tune. And you saw my finger move, and it was more in tune because I did that. So one of the most important things for playing in tune on the cello has got to be, in addition to your ears and learning your scales and everything, but don't get too secure thinking that if you're in the right position that you have the right intonation. Your finger, alone can touch the string any number of different ways that it's going to impact how short you've made the string. So it doesn't really matter where your hand goes or where your hand's angled if you're within this much of a margin of error. Everything else is going to come from context in your ear. So another really good thing to do is to try to use drones to practice. If you put on a drone, it's kind of the equivalent of playing an open string and then tuning these notes. So let's talk about that melodic versus harmonic intonation thing, and I'm going to use playing the open G string as my own drone. You can also go online and find drones, which can be really useful. They can also lull you into a sort of dreamy state. They're not very musical. They just sit there. I shouldn't say that because a lot of music does use drones, but it's not going to be immediately helpful for music that does go through a lot of chord changes. However, it's going to be a really great way for you to try different intonations out. So let's talk a little bit about that melodic versus harmonic thing in the context of using a drone, I'll give you a couple of other drone tips and tricks, and then we'll start concluding this video. So let's play a D major scale. Okay, so again, there's kind of two ways to be tuning this, because we want all of the notes to sound good next to each other. But those notes aren't equally tempered, nor are they all tuned to the open G string, because this is a D major chord, not a G major, or D major scale, not a G major scale. So you might be able to hear that, and kudos to you if you can, because if you can, then you can start trying to solve the problem. So step one, of course, is listening, but step two is, what are the tunings for each note that's going to be in tune to the G string? So that's already a little sharp than we might have otherwise played. And at each one of those notes, really like then take the time to... So we did get up to the octave. So this will be another interesting one, because if we're tuning the third of the G string, then we're like a little sharp compared to the D. Now, what we can do is, once we've gone through all of these notes and we've kind of considered what they all can do, we can again kind of blend what we're doing. So I think what this amounts to is that you're going to initially hit the note in a way that makes sense melodically, settling into the note in a way that makes sense harmonically, so that we're in tune to the G. The C sharp was a little off. So that sounds a lot more in tune, and it's a little subtle, but it has to do with paying attention to both of the ways that we can hear intonation at the same time and being able to blend them. So that's where intonation just gets really, really tricky with cello and violin, and why even the best players still have intonation problems. It just is it goes really, really, really deep. And I would say that even the current state of music doesn't have a great answer for how to handle intonation, especially for complicated music, which is why a lot of music, when you start to actually like listen for the equal temperament thing, it sounds a little out of tune. And it's kind of a bummer, because, you know, we get locked into it. We're so used to hearing everything equal temperament. Everything is tuned 440. Everything is equal temperament. And it's like, that's nice, but it's not perfectly in tune. So that's something I want you guys to consider. When you hear somebody perform and they sound spectacularly in tune, every motion of their finger is contributing to that, both in terms of the melodic sense and the harmonic sense. So when you're practicing, I encourage you to practice your scales slowly and thoughtfully with the intonation, to try to practice double stops and tune them, even if you're going really, really slow and don't get them up to speed right yet. Use drones, and I love using drones the way I just did, where it's not actually the root note you're tuning to. That's really going to train your ear to listen to the note you're tuning to, and not just get used to the normal way of playing a major scale in tune, if that makes sense. So I hope that this video was a little helpful for, if not demystifying, because I feel like, you know, you can learn all this stuff about intonation and it's like, brain canceling, cannot do it. All you need to do, though, is know it to start, knowing how complex it is. So hopefully this video was a good introduction to what intonation really is, maybe a helpful answer as to why it's so freaking hard, and hopefully a little bit of good instruction for things you can do to actively improve your intonation. Of course, all of the ways you can be in tune cover the whole span of music making. They don't just fit in this video, but you can take what we've talked about in this video and apply it to the music that you're learning and all the music to come. So with that, I think this video is wrapped up. Once again, my name's Justin Leopard. I'm also known as the Vagabond Cellist, and this has been a production with Higher Hertz. Please subscribe below for more cello lesson videos, like the video, and comment how everything's going for you, if this information was helpful, what you'd like to see. We'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.